Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications. Patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
Welcome to the Goddard Report. Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Bev Harris, founder of Black Box Voting, online at blackboxvoting.org. She looks into election fraud. She's speaking to us from Carlsbad, Washington. Bev, welcome back to the Goddard Report.
Well, thanks for having me.
Bev, we have a federal election here in Canada on October 21st. Has the federal election process in Canada changed since the last election in 2015?
I don't see anything major that's changed, although I do see that they are kind of pushing more use of some of the high-risk voting methods like absentee voting and early voting.
How are those riskier?
Well, essentially, when you vote at a polling place, there are scrutineers and there's observers, and people can see that it's an actual person. Whenever you vote absentee, you don't really know where the ballots came from. They could just be ghost people or just names on a list that somebody put in there. So one person could put in a whole bunch of ballots. With early voting, it's a little bit better than absentee voting in terms of risk, but there's still a chain of custody problem where the ballots are sitting around for weeks, and that's never a good situation. The biggest risks for paper ballots are during transit and while they're sitting around somewhere in someone's office.
Voters list integrity. Are non-Canadians able to get on the voters list without proof of citizenship?
It's pretty good. I kind of wish, I live in the U.S., I kind of wish we had the Canadian federal election process. You are required to produce proof, and you are required to produce ID. There's been some controversy over it because, for example, there was a family that hosted quite a few foreign exchange students, and they received letters in the mail. And they thought, they're trying to register them, they're foreigners. But it actually wasn't a voter registration form. It was a letter that was sent to all high school students. And so it was a generic letter. When they actually went to register, presumably if they followed the rules, they would not have been able to register.
Where someone in Canada vouches for another person to get added to the voter roll without proof of citizenship, is this a loophole that could be exploited?
Not on a one-by-one basis. Whenever you look at the concepts for election fraud, the ones that are the really dangerous ones are where it doesn't involve a big conspiracy. It involves only a few people, such as insiders, and it can affect a substantial number of votes. So when I say not on a one-by-one basis, the risk area would be that somebody who's working with the database could add voters without actually having them be valid voters. And they wouldn't need to be valid in a number of ways. They could be perhaps not citizens. They could also just be people who are, duplicates, similar names, made up, various different things. So the person who handles the database is the big risk.
How safe would online voting be?
It's probably the most terrible idea you can possibly get. And by the way, there's an active investigation right now of a situation that looks fairly well documented where there was an organization called IntelliVote that ran an election. I believe it was in Alberta. And one of the political hacks owned a car dealership, and allegedly he was taking people from his car dealership and sticking them into the voter database by registering them. There you go, one person handling a lot. And apparently they had a whole bunch of bogus people on the list or bogus emails, And they found out that about 3/4 of them cast votes of the bogus emails. So, the problem is when you can't see who it is that actually casts the vote, you are basically sending an invitation to party hacks or operatives to cast lots of votes in other people's names. So it's not the idea that you have a bunch of terrible people, coming in on a bus and casting votes. It's one person who's using those names to cast illicit votes.
Is it true, the more primitive your voting system, I don't know if that's the right word, but if you're using paper ballots versus electronic, does that make it less likely that there will be fraud?
Oh, yes. Hand-marked paper ballots counted by hand is the best way there is, and that's what Canada does. I wish we did that here. Now, just having a paper ballot isn't a magic bullet if you don't hand count it. It's running. If you have a computer telling you what it was, then you still don't really know. And people say, "Oh, well, but you could check." Well, not really, because look at the laws. Usually, they don't let you check. But the way they do federal elections in Canada, they're basically paper ballot, hand counted. Now, the provincial and especially the municipal elections in Canada are pretty terrible in terms of not having paper records. If they do have paper records, they run them through some machine. They really have much worse control than your federal elections.
Is it true now with artificial intelligence you can tell individual marks in each box where you're supposed to put an X, so my X is unique to anybody else's?
Well, if you hand mark it, you don't even need artificial intelligence. You can't tell who voted it, but you can tell that it's unique from the others. And that's really important because if you have a whole bunch of hand-marked paper ballots and you let's say you just run them through and get photocopies of them and people can look at those, you can actually tell because those will have slightly different markings, each one from one to the other. Now, if the machine is printing a bunch of ballots, which is the latest thing in the U.S., you go up and you type it into a machine and then it prints out a ballot, well, then you're not going to be able to tell those ballots apart. And it could print 100,000, of its own rendition of the ballots, and you wouldn't be able to know they were fake.
How is the data for voters' lists collected? Is it accurate? And is it open to fraud?
Well, it is in Canada. You are supposed to register using a formal procedure. You can register online. It's less open to fraud than the United States by quite a bit because you have, for example, national health cards. You have a national registry. In the United States, we don't have a national registry. We only have state things. And our Social Security card, for example, we don't even use that to vote. It doesn't have a picture. So you can authenticate who you are when you register. That's a good thing. It still doesn't really prevent someone who's handling the database, though, from tampering in a way that could either remove valid voters, could change their information so that when they show up to vote, they're rejected, or add voters who are not valid.
Have past elections in Canada involved any fraud?
Every place on the face of the earth has had elections that are involved in fraud. Elections control power, and probably most important, they control money. In fact, people think, oh, it's just a little local election. Well, the little local elections, when you add them all up, control hundreds of billions of dollars in contracts. So, I imagine people are familiar with some of the current scandals in Canada, the one with, SNC, the Lavalin one, the one that Trudeau was in controversy for. Those things are contract fraud, where the company that's getting huge, massive government contracts is doing something it shouldn't. So when you have that amount of money flowing through decision makers, there's always going to be someone who wants to put their thumb on the scale. But the key there is making it transparent so that it can be seen. For example, let me give you an example of election fraud, but it was transparent and could be seen. There was a situation where people voted at the polling place, hand-counted ballots, and one of the political guys strolled in and picked up a bunch of ballots off the table, and the poll worker called him back. Now, you can see that, right? You can't see it if it's online. You can see a guy come in and pick up a bunch of ballots. The poll worker called him back. He didn't give her back all the ballots, though, right? He just gave her back some. And so because of that, it was messed up, and they canceled it and had to redo it. Now, the difference there is because the process was transparent, people could see the attempt at fraud, and they could do something. The more electronic it gets, especially the more remote it gets, where people are casting from a remote location, the less transparent and the easier it is to enact a fairly large fraud without being detected.
We'll have more with Bev Harris right after this.
Abin Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia and the Yukon, trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the OTCQB, symbol ABNAF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Abin's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at abinresources.com.
Cypress Development Corp. is developing a world-class lithium resource in the heart of Clayton Valley, Nevada. The size of the resource makes the Clayton Valley project a premier asset with the potential to impact the future of lithium supply. Cypress Development Corp. trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol CYP, the OTCQB, symbol CYDVF, and on Frankfurt, symbol C1Z1. For more information, please visit our website, cypressdevelopmentcorp.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Bev Harris. Bev, are you hearing any possible concerns of fraud happening in Canada's October 21st election?
Well, people should always be concerned because there's an incentive. So there's a couple things. One thing that is pretty important is to do some monitoring and to do some scrutinizing if you are concerned. One of the things that I'm picking up that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with is they're starting to say, oh, well, we did it, but we're doing an ongoing investigation of something that some guy had happened several years ago, and therefore we don't think he should be allowed to take his position until the investigation is over. Now, that's not out-and-out election fraud, but it's a method, it's a political method to try to block or delay people from taking office. And I've seen a couple of those things happening where the drumbeat is, oh, you know, we think they did something wrong, we haven't proved it yet, but don't let them sit until we prove it. And it takes years and years to prove it. So that's something I would be concerned about with the upcoming election. In terms of, well, there's run-of-the-mill fraud, which can happen, and it can be fairly well orchestrated at a high level, and that's what's important, that it's transparent. Check the numbers. If you have, you know, more votes show up than there were voters, that's a problem, and people need to be looking at those and not just say, oh, the government's going to do that for us. We shouldn't worry about it.
What are the most common forms of voter fraud?
I always call it election fraud because voter fraud kind of implies that you've got one or two people running around doing things. Election fraud is the insiders, and it depends on the system that's used. I think the most proven one, the one that has the longest history of case after case after case being proven, absentee voting fraud. I looked at the numbers, and it looks like currently about 10% of the votes are coming into Canada absentee, which it didn't used to be that high. That's quite low compared to the United States. California, for example, is 80% absentee. But 10% can still sway an election fairly easily. So those absentee votes have a huge history everywhere of being used for fraudulent elections. And this, I'm not talking about suspicions. I'm talking about people convicted going to jail for rigging the absentee vote. The biggest risk, again, being the insiders who have access to the lists, or the insiders who have access to the ballots.
In this Canadian federal election, are paper ballots being used as a backup?
Well, they're being used as it's not just a backup. Only the paper ballot is being counted. So that's a good thing. So again, that rules out one whole type of fraud, which is the electronic counting type of fraud. So I think with your election, the risks are more in the early votes. They're in what's happening to the ballots and who cast the ballots. And that's not so much on election day at polls. It is the early voting and the absentee voting, which when you put those two together, and also you have something where you can vote at Elections Canada offices, and those ballots are sitting around. And of course they will tell you that it is secure, but there should be a surveillance video on those things. That should be a public record that people can take a look at if they're concerned.
Are any of the questionable electronic voting machines being used in Canada's elections?
All the time in local and municipal elections, not in the federal. Thank goodness. You're lucky.
We'll have more with Bev Harris right after this.
Engineer Gold Mines is focused on the exploration and development of the historic high-grade Engineer Gold Mine situated 32 kilometers southwest of Atlin, British Columbia. Engineer Gold Mines is fully permitted for surface and underground exploration with the 2019 drill program now underway. Engineer Gold Mines Limited trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol EAU. For more information, please visit us at engineergoldmines.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Bev Harris. Bev, in the U.S. elections, it looks like the left benefited from voter fraud or misrepresentation. Is President Trump working to solve that?
Well, I guess I would quibble with that statement. That is being put out by some political types, but there's not really very good proof that the left benefited from widespread voter fraud. There have been some attempts at it, and then it turned out they kind of fell through when people actually investigated and tried to prove them. So, Trump has done what nobody else who's a big-time politician has done, though. He has questioned the risk associated with counting the votes on electronic voting machines. And nobody else is willing to do that in the U.S. In Canada, again, in your federal elections, you're not using the electronic counting. We're using it for almost 100% of our votes. And it is not, the way it's used now, it's definitely not a valid way to count votes in terms of risk of fraud. And he's the only one who's actually confronting that. He also has asked people to look at the potential for voter fraud. And again, in the United States, voter fraud, if you're looking at an insider who's putting the wrong names on the list or taking them off, taking off the right names, it's a much bigger problem than Canada because we have no national database. And so you've got each state handling it sort of willy-nilly and not well secured. There were documented cases of foreign, not just foreign, but of intrusions, basically people hacking into those databases. In fact, this is so terrible, but some years back I was trying to get some election forms and I was doing a search and I accidentally got into the Ohio State database of voters myself. And I'm like, oh no, I need to get out of here. I shouldn't be in here. But it is actually, they're really Swiss cheese. They're so open here. And I don't know how well they're secured in Canada. There have certainly been documented cases of hackers getting at those databases here in the U.S. And I don't know that it would be any different to expect that they might be after it in Canada, other than you have a little bit better, you have a national database and there's a little bit more potential to at least do something about it to remedy it.
In order to to spot potential election fraud, what should Canadians be on the lookout for?
One of my favorite things to look for is numbers that don't add up. Basic arithmetic. I call them impossible numbers. These have been found. They've been found in Canada. For example, you'll have a certain number of votes show up and be counted, and then when you go and check how many people actually voted in that location, you find out it's a completely different number, as in fewer people voted. I found that here in the U.S. too. I found in Memphis there was an election where there were 3,000 more votes than people who voted. So when you see those impossible numbers, you know you've got a problem. It's a good idea to show up and watch the counting. And it's a good idea to, if you're really interested in this stuff, to ask and just say, hey, can I get a copy of the surveillance tape, where you were in your ballot, storage place, for example. And it's interesting, my biggest thing is, the more they resist, the more suspicious you need to be. If they say, sure, fill out this form and here it is, that's good. If they start saying, oh no, you can't have that, nobody can have that, we can't let anybody see that, then that gives you kind of a pointer as to where there might be problems going on.
If you were in charge of the voting process for Canada's federal election, what would you do to combat election fraud?
Well, I would make your municipal and provincial elections follow the same rules as your federal elections in terms of polling place voting, ID required, hand counting the paper ballots. First thing I would do would be eliminate that, because corruption kind of bubbles up from the local level on up. And so you've got pretty weak procedures locally. For the federal elections, I think I would take a much closer look at how those voter lists are come up with and what the security is on them, and what the changes are over time. One of the things I did once was I just got a copy of the voter list, the voter registration list, at various points in time. And I just compared one to the next, and I saw that they were erasing people. This was in Tennessee, and they had taken like 10,000 people, and just changed their record in past elections. So in other words, I would have an election that would say they voted in 2006, and I would have the same voter history from 2010, and it said they did not vote in 2006. Well, that was a problem, because when we have people who don't vote for a period of time, they can be purged from the list.
Is there any danger that Canada's election results are being hacked into by foreign outsiders?
Well, if you have hand-counted paper ballots and polling place voting, they can't hack that. If you have computer-counted votes, whether they're paper or not, that can be hacked. So, the old method there is the least hackable. You can game it. My example of the guy walking in and grabbing a bunch of ballots off the table, but that's really hard to do on a national scale, impossible to do, and it's easily caught. So the more you can't see how the count is happening, the more you can't see what's going on, the higher the risk that a foreign entity could compromise it.
How can people find out more about black box voting?
Blackboxvoting.org is the website. There's a lot of basic information on there. Right now I'm working on a bunch of updated stuff that will also be on YouTube, but we're not it's not out yet. It will be before the end of the year when we start our US elections. But there's a lot of information on blackboxvoting.org.
Bev, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you. You're welcome.
My guest has been Bev Harris, founder of Black Box Voting online at blackboxvoting.org. If you have any questions for our guests, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com are an expression of opinion only. The Goddard Report is available online and mobile at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. The Goddard Report is a production of How Street Media Incorporated.